Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panel on If We Do Nothing, Earth's Climate at the Tipping Point, moderated by Financial Times U.S. Editor-at-Large, Gillian Tett.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session. Now, as a journalist, I've been very struck in the last couple of days by the degree to which people are talking about change in the mindset, change in attitudes, change in the political climate. And the fact we're meeting here this morning, to my mind, is a very telling sign of change. Because I think if the Milken Institute had put on a session on climate change 5 years ago, we'd probably be sitting in a cupboard somewhere down a long corridor because there wouldn't be this level of interest. But today, in the last couple of days, almost everybody is talking about climate change to some degree. We've heard about it on the political stage with the Green New Deal discussions. We heard about it just last week from central banks who formed a new group to try and look at climate change as a financial stability issue. We heard about it yesterday from Christine Lagarde, who said, somewhat remarkably, that although income inequality was a massive threat to the current capitalist system, climate change is even more of a danger, because if we don't do anything about it in the next 20 years, there won't be a planet and a capitalist system to protect. So it's become a huge theme. The question, of course, though, is do we correctly understand the scale of risks that are developing? Are we actually doing enough to combat it? And what can you lot, who are mostly, I would imagine, in the financial and business sphere, what can you do in this arena? We have an amazing group of panelists to talk about this issue this morning. On my far right, your left, is Edgar Bronfman, who of course needs almost no introduction, as one of the great sort of investors with Autonomy. Next to him is Robert Gibbins, who is with another great investor from, I'm having a mind blow, from your Autonomy, your Endeavor, Next to me is Paul Hawken, who has spent much of his life campaigning on climate change issues and trying to make sure that the world takes them seriously while also proposing some solutions. Next to him is Roland Hwang, who is with the National Resources Defense Council, a group that's been also campaigning on environmental issues. And at the end is Matt Rogers, senior partner at McKinsey, who has been overseeing much of their environmental analysis in recent years. So, Paul, I'd like to start with you. Actually, no, before I do that, I'd like to start quickly with all of you to make sure you're all awake and listening. How many people in the room are invested in something which is environmentally aware? Okay, so you're talking to a pretty interested and engaged audience. How many of you think that we are currently talking about the climate change challenges with the appropriate level of seriousness? One. Wow. Paul, do you think we understand the magnitude of the climate change threats? Just how bad is the situation right now?
I don't think we do understand it. I don't think anybody understands, so I don't want to point to myself and say, I do, you don't. That's not true at all. I think the enormity of what we are in, not going to happen, it is happening. We're in a slow motion climatic apocalypse. And there's no other word for it. We've never really dealt with apocalypse. We think of them as sudden instead of over decades, decadal. And we're in that situation right now. And so we don't have to worry about climate change anymore because it is absolutely here already and affecting us, impacting us, and affecting people all over the world. There's one slide I have which
it's slide 9 for the people who are manning the
slide 9,
technology.
Yeah, and it's just a simple slide. And actually it shows CO2 levels for 400,000 years, and that dotted line is 300 ppm, and until 1950 that's where it was. And it's widely ascribed that pre-industrial levels were 280, some people say 260, and what you hear is that we're at 412 ppm right now. But the actual level of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gases, counting methane, nitrous oxide, CFC, sulfur hexafluoride, is 492 ppm, and that's according to the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration of the U.S. government. And that's the highest level of CO2 in the atmosphere for 20 million years. And if you want to Google what happened 20 million years ago, I suggest you don't do it at night. It was absolutely astonishing. There's 10,000-pound boulders in Bermuda. They were brought there in a storm. Okay, that's the kind of weather that we are anticipating, lest we take extraordinary action. I think everybody in the panel here will support me in the understanding that it's a much graver situation than I think is commonly understood or spoken about in the media. And even scientists have sort of tamped down it because it seems not credible. It didn't work to invoke fear and threat and doom. But everybody here is going to talk about solutions as well.
Right. Well, Paul, you spent your lifetime very admirably trying to ring alarm bells and draw attention to this. McKinsey is not usually in the business of making apocalyptic projections. Your projections tend to be wrapped up in lots of number crunching and very carefully couched phrases and things like that. Would you agree with what Paul said about the severity of the problem?
So as we look at it, the thing that has struck us most sharply, most recently, is that what was 20 years ago a 1 in 300-year event is now a 1 in 10-year event. So we've had a 30 times increase in the likelihood of a tail event happening. What does that mean? That means that we are significantly that means that it's an issue today. It's not a 2030 issue, a 2040 issue, a 2050 issue. It's a today issue, and it's a today issue that requires a very large capital formation challenge. The difficulty is that the risk in terms of how people are exposed to climate change is not evenly distributed. We're starting this piece of work now on the granularity of climate risk because if you're in the US, Miami and Chicago aren't going to be influenced the same by climate. And in the US, you think about it, and a lot of people say, I can just buy my way out of the problem. And so the challenge now is we see a market where we are over-investing in a set of risky asset classes. Let's call it Miami real estate for today. We are significantly underinvesting in the required levels of resiliency investments in the market. We're not building enough seawalls. We're not creating infrastructure that is appropriately resilient for the market. We're not investing enough in innovation. And the scale of delivery for the abatement solutions, the world does 2 gigawatts of solar every week, and we need to do something like 8 to 10. And we have neither the capital formation models nor the economic delivery models that match. And so what's gotten us motivated is how do we create the economic structure, capital formation, and essentially capital infrastructure development that is necessary to meet a test that is a today problem. And I think that's what's driving us.
Right. Well, Roland, I mean, you've spent a lot of years working with this NGO group. You're based in California, which is really at the sharp end of the spear right now in terms of much of this debate and much of the experience and the problems. People have traditionally looked to the government to do this. Do you think that's enough right now?
Well, absolutely, government has to be part of the solution. And I think that when you look at where climate politics is in this country today, I think the first place to start looking is what is science telling us? And that's driving a lot of the politics and is driving a lot of interest in solving this crisis. So there are 2 very important scientific reports that came out last fall. One by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and one that was called the National Climate Assessment. 3 key takeaways from these reports. 1, climate change is here and now and is having, in some cases, devastating impacts on people's lives, and it's worse than we thought. It's going to get worse than we thought in the future. 2nd is urgency. We do not have 10 or 12 years. There are some reports about the IPCC report that said we have 10 or 12 years to act. That's completely incorrect. We have to act now. We have to cut global carbon emissions in half in 10 years, then half again in the next 10 years, and get to net zero by 2050 to avert the worst of climate change. But the third point, very critically, a more subtle point here, is that there is no threshold effect when it comes to climate change. Right? 1.5 degrees is certainly better than 2 degrees, but 2 degrees is better than 2.5. 2.5 is better than 3. The important thing, take carbon out of the air now. Stop polluting carbon pollution. That's the most critical thing. And luckily what we are seeing, because of all of the realization of what's occurring, we are seeing a change in American politics when it comes to climate change, which is we're seeing a policy window of opportunity. The number one reason why we're seeing this is because Americans are starting to realize that climate change is not something 50 to 75 years in the future, something for your children or your children's children to worry about. It's happening now. In short, climate change is changing the politics of climate change. 5 of the 10 worst wildfires in California history last 2 years. Hurricane Harvey struck Texas in 2017, once in 500,000 year storm, $300 billion in damage in 2017. As a result, 73% of Americans now believe climate change is real. The amount of Americans that are very worried about climate change is at an all-time high. It has gone up 8 points in less than a year.
Right.
And we see this change happening across demographics, across geographies. And fortunately, our political leaders are starting to respond, and we see in Washington discussion about the Green New Deal, and others put climate change squarely on the map for action for our political leaders.
Right.
It's already happening in California and other states. And what's happening right now, too, very interesting enough, is that in Washington, a very bleak place for policy currently, is that the debate is shifting from the science to the solutions, with even Republicans like Senator Alexander saying climate change is real.
Right. Well, I'm going to come back later and ask Paul whether he thinks the shift is nearly enough. I'm sure the answer is no, but hold that for the moment, because I want to bring in 2 investors. And so, first of all, I'd like to ask Edgar. Apologies for calling you from Autonomy. You're, of course, from Endeavor, chairman of Endeavor. You have been at the forefront of talking about ways to use investment muscle in the climate change arena for quite a while. Tell us how you see the issue right now. And would you like your slides up? Because if so, they're slides number 1 and 2 in the charts.
I would like them up. And I think the point that I'd like to make today, and I'm really here as chairman of Global Thermostat, though I do chair a philanthropy called Endeavor, is I want to point everyone to the red line and the blue space below. The red line is the IPCC. This is the IPCC report that basically says we have to start declining. The red line is carbon emissions in 2020. So that's now. We have to start, and they have to start coming down incredibly sharply. And I don't know if you were here Sunday afternoon, but Bob Dudley, the CEO of BP, pointed out that there are currently 8 different countries in the world, each of whom is building 1 coal plant a week. In the 20th century, India and China were effectively not powered. So a third of the world's population is now being powered, and most of that power is coming from coal. So the idea that that red line is going to do what we'd like is simply not going to happen. But even if it did happen, and this is the point I want to make, that blue line says those are the negative emissions we must have. And that starts with 1 billion tons of CO2 out of the air, not through trees, not through the ocean, not through all the normal mechanisms. But in addition to all of those things, in addition to solar, in addition to wind, in addition to everything else that you've heard about, by 2030, we need to be taking 1 billion tons of CO2 out of the air under this scenario, and by 2100, 20 billion tons. And again, just to remind everyone, 1 million seconds is 12 days, 1 billion seconds is 32 years. It's a lot of money, a lot of tons that have to come out. On the second slide, is just a case that says we reduce that CO2 emission reduction goes at half the pace of that red line, which is a far more likely scenario. And that just increases the necessity from where we were to probably 5 billion tons in 2030, 20 billion tons in 2050, and 45 billion tons a year in 2100. Fortunately, and again, we are going to have to rely on things like direct air capture, things that can actually suck CO2 out of the air. And actually, McKinsey's said that the CO2 market, meaning products from CO2 and sequestration, will probably reach $1 trillion in 2030 from effectively zero today. And $1 trillion may be a lot, and maybe it's more than that, maybe it's a tenth of that. It's still a huge, huge business. And if you can take CO2 out of the air at a reasonable cost, not only can you sequester it, particularly if we get government subsidies like the California Low Fuel Standard, which applies everywhere, but we can also, anything that carbon from the ground can make, carbon from the air can make. So we can make fuels, we can make plastic. And I know people don't like plastic, but let me just tell you, plastic won't kill us, CO2 will kill us. So in my view, I would sequester it anywhere, anytime. We can add it to concrete. We can create building materials. We can create more fertilizer because it's a natural fertilizer. Each of these markets are enormous, enormous markets. There is currently today no supply of CO2. It's very, very constrained. The only place where it is in abundance is in the air. There's also no distribution infrastructure to move millions of tons of CO2. So you have to have a system that takes the CO2 out of the air wherever the customer is that needs it. Fortunately, there are 3 companies, mine is one, that are doing this, and the costs are coming down rapidly, and it's incredible that each of these companies struggle to get anybody to invest in them.
Why is no one investing in this stuff, Robert? Do you think investors understand the level of risks when they're looking at their portfolios today? Because, a lot of them will say, yeah, we're doing ESG, yeah, it's fine. Do you think they understand it? And why isn't there more money, as Matt said earlier, about actually going into this kind of, positive response to climate change challenges?
So at Autonomy, we spend our time looking for big changes in policies, politics, economics, and the resultant asset price changes. And climate is one of these things that influences all of those. And I think there are a number of points I'd like to make here. First, on the cost of carbon. I think that you've heard from Mr. Bronfman that there are technologies that are going to be developed that enable us to capture carbon and ultimately store it. That's what's required. That's the whole basis of the IPCC report. More on that later. That requires an explicit price of carbon. An explicit price of carbon. And so when you think about stranded assets, don't think just about coal. Think about how your assets perform, how your companies perform with an explicit price of carbon. Now, you don't have to think that this will happen tomorrow, although Autonomy thinks this is going to happen much sooner than people think, but you have to know what you think. And to us, where carbon pricing is going to go, it's going to go to the cost of industrial scale marginal abatement. So it's going to be the cheapest price of industrial scale marginal abatement. Put that in your portfolios and see what happens. It's not pretty. Okay. The second thing is the cost of climate. You've heard earlier in this panel gentlemen saying that we really don't understand the severity. One of the things that I was struck by is effectively the framing of the issue. 1.5 degrees by 2100 if we take radical action, IPCC. Go back to sleep. But when we go and talk to the scientists, they don't believe that. When we ask some of the people who wrote the IPCC, why did you write this? They say, well, we were specifically politically asked to write it. What do they believe? They think we're looking at 2.5 to 7 on current policies, and they think 3 to 4 is where they'd be a base case, with the Paris commitments from national governments summing up to 3.4 degrees centigrade. These are huge changes. These are average changes. What does that mean? It means that as the market understands, it's not about 1.5 or 2. It's about a completely different frame of uncertainty. The vol of vol is going to explode. That is the key takeaway. The vol of vol is going to explode. Now, you guys can be saying, well, maybe, but it's 2040 or 2050 or 2060. I'll give you an example. We talked to a sea level rise scientific expert. He says, look, right now, 3 millimeters sounds about right. But in 2070, my range is 3 millimeters at 5.5 centimeters per annum. And that's the sort of uncertainty that creates volatility in the market. It's a huge issue. And I think the idea that we can understand that there's an issue, we can understand there's a great deal of uncertainty around the issue, right? And that we somehow can't present value that uncertainty back to today's pricing as our collective psychology shifts, and it can shift in an instant. I don't understand it. So it's not a 2060 issue, 2050 issue. It's an issue of when our collective psychology shifts to present value back that uncertainty. Those would be some of the things I'd say.
And if you're a betting person, before I turn to Paul, if you're a betting person, or if you had to make a guesstimate, what proportion of investors that you speak to have actually tried to price that into their portfolios right now? Because, the central banks came out, the central banks of all people who are not paid to be alarmists came out last week and so they reckon that, 17% of global assets may be mispriced, under a climate change scenario. How many people do you think have actually priced that into their portfolios?
Very few. Very few.
How many people in the room think that they have correctly priced their portfolios for climate change risk? Okay, you're either all asleep or shy or very realistic, or all three at once. But Paul, when you see that, okay, for you it must on one level be quite gratifying, because when you started talking about this 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, you were a pretty lonely voice, and you weren't being invited to conferences like Milken back then, were you?
No. The oligarchy didn't want to talk to me.
Okay, so now the oligarchy is talking to you.
Yeah.
How does that feel?
Well, how do you do? It feels great.
Are you encouraged by this, or do you think this is just window dressing?
I love it. I mean, we talked about this, before we came on stage, and we just said, look, it's all hands on deck. There's this idea in the environmental movement that direct air capture and CCS, carbon capture systems on flue gases, is a moral hazard. Well, and we said the only moral hazard is inaction at this point. So that's the moral hazard, which is to think about it, talk about it, and so forth. But I also think that the framing, we have to shift that, because it's not about protecting the capitalist system. It's like, can we have a capitalist system that protects life on Earth? That's the question. And that means a lot of underlying assumptions, and even NPV and other things that we use internally to the capitalist system are actually invalid, because it's a nonlinear system. Roland just spoke about that. The rate of change is not linear, and therefore we can have these extraordinary changes rather suddenly, like the 500-year floods every 2 years, which is happening in Canada. The last time we had climate change was the Maunder minimum in the 17th century. The temperature went down 1 degree. Why? For two reasons. It's interesting. One is because of low sunspot activity. The other was because Europeans went to South America and basically extirpated 90% of the indigenous population, and their farmlands went back to forests and bamboo, and there was enormous carbon sequestration. And the temperature went down. 1/3 of humanity died from that. 1/3 of humanity perished during that period. That's just 1 degree. It's 1 degree centigrade down. And we're talking about, we're already 1 degree centigrade up. And we are going up so fast, so forth. So for me, another problem about it is we focus on the probability of what's going to go wrong. And the other thing we focus on is the idea of the 1.5C, 2C, 2.5C, 3C, 4C. I'm sorry, go out today. Go out on a man, woman on the street and say, what does 2C mean to you in 2050? And they'll go, huh? And they'll think they're talking to somebody who's like crazy. Like, it means nothing to 99% of humanity. And so the problem is we can talk to each other, but we have to communicate in such a way that we engage all of humanity. When you talk about energy direct air capture and what Matt's spoken about, Roland, we're talking about urgency, and there is urgency here. But we also have to talk about agency. That is the enrollment of everybody on Earth to think that this is not only thinking but feeling, but knowing that working towards a regenerative planet where we reverse global warming is in their interest. And right now, it's in their disinterest because they're so pressed by their own needs.
So, but Roland, I'd like to ask you this. How much of an impediment is it that we have a White House that has not taken up this cause, to put it politely? I mean, as you see, 73% of people say they care about it now in America. There's even a branch of the Republican Party which is saying we have to start talking about it, but please can we find a word that isn't climate change to describe it? But, people say to me, well, actually, it doesn't really matter what the White House does because businesses, investors, states are getting involved, so that's the real impetus. Do you think it matters?
We think it matters a lot. We think it matters a lot what California does, what Washington State, what New Mexico has done, and all these other states that are on the cusp of passing clean energy bills. Washington absolutely matters. And if there's a single most important decision maker, I would say to the fate of the planet here, is that person in the White House. And the person in the White House right now, unfortunately, believes that climate change is a hoax and is actually not just an impediment to climate action, is actually rolling back some of these common sense standards that we put on power plants, on clean cars, on oil and gas production. They're attempting to roll all of these common sense standards back, in some cases, in many cases actually, without the support of industry. The auto companies do not want chaos, regulatory chaos, because California has its own standards. It's going to have regulatory chaos by having two standards. They've been asking the White House for one standard and not to roll back. The government absolutely has to be part of the solution here. When you look at the capital flows necessary, we talked a lot about capital flows here. There has to be some sort of signal, some sort of rules of the game in regards to how industry is going to make it, and business are going to make investments forward in order to influence those capital flows. Government investment by itself cannot do that, whether it's US or whether it's China or it's India. There has to be common sense performance standards. Edgar mentioned earlier the low carbon fuel standard here in California. It's quite gratified to hear that, because that's actually a policy that I worked on over 10 years ago with Governor Schwarzenegger. We need common sense performance-based standards to send the signal to industry where to invest and what kind of technologies to deploy. We need to match that up with investments from government where they can, tax incentives, infrastructure investments. But that's how we will get this economy moving in the right direction when we have government and business working hand in hand.
Right. I mean, Matt, when you have companies coming to you for advice right now, and you say, okay, we now believe this issue is real, what do you tell them they could and should do right now?
Well, I think you hit on one of the themes earlier, which is testing a portfolio actually is useful. If you just take a Nordhaus standard for what the price on carbon would need to be to get to 4 degrees, that's essentially a $40 a ton world. So 4 degrees, $40 a ton. If you want to get, let's call it a Lord Stern standard, if you want to get down to 2 degrees, that's probably $120 a ton. And so test the portfolio at those two numbers and figure out what kind of investment choices you would make. I think that's one. I think the second one is really to, and a number of the U.S. utilities, for example, are doing this now, to really understand the climate risk to the existing infrastructure today, whether you're a refiner in Texas or whether you're a power player. In Hurricane Harvey, we lost 26 gigawatts of power due to storm issues. The system that we've built in California, obviously, was not designed for the current climatic conditions, and we have to rebuild the entire system. And I think one of the challenges that we face is really understanding the true capital requirements to do that, and then beginning to put in place the kind of delivery capacity to make that happen. I mean, California is doing some great things, but we're nowhere near to be on a path to AB 32, which is supposed to be in 2030, because the capital investment requirements, whether it's in transportation or in power, are not in place to bring the capital into the state to make that happen. The other side of it, when I was served in the U.S. government, we tried to spend $3.4 billion in 2009 on carbon capture and sequestration, and we couldn't get enough applications because the rate of innovation in that space was behind the requirement of the marketplace. And so I think things like 45Q now that create some real incentives, if you can price it right, can drive the kind of capital formation and infrastructure development that's required. But we really have to understand, here's the total quantity of capital that we need, and begin to understand what the incentive structures are necessary to bring the capital into the market at some level of speed.
Right. I mean, Edgar, do you see enough sign that people who you've grown up over the years with in the financial investing technology community are taking this seriously enough? Do you still regard yourself as an outlier?
I don't think it's possible to take this seriously enough, and certainly no one's taking it seriously enough, or almost no one. I really would like, though, to try and frame, to lead off what you just said, which is capital formation and adjusting your portfolios is fine, but what is all that in aid of? Where is the capital going to go? What is it going to go for? What is it going to do? And obviously, one of the things it needs to do is create far more renewable energy than it's doing. It needs to find much better ways to lower emissions. It needs to find ways to take CO2 out of the air and either sequester it permanently in the ground or use it in industries, or both. And I would actually like to frame this in what I would call a more positive approach to a devastating, apocalyptic problem. And that is, in World War II, in 1939, the United States had 1,700 planes. In 1945, it had 300,000 planes. It made a plane an hour. I would like to think of this as the answer to this is the environmental industrial complex. In other words, instead of thinking about climate change as things we have to stop, instead of thinking about climate change only in terms of being punished, we can and should think about climate change also as an enormous opportunity to build new industries. When the government made the car manufacturers increase miles per gallon, huge industries were created. Catalytic converters were invented. I mean, there's a huge opportunity here to move capital to places that will benefit humanity. And I do think, my last comment to Paul, I agree 1,000%, which is capitalism only deserves to survive if it can save the planet first. And then it's got to solve income inequality and all those other things. But capitalism has no business promoting the extinction of humanity. And I think capitalism has to prove that. And it can. It can. But time is running out. It's running out very, very fast. Right.
I'm very curious to hear you say, draw parallels with World War II, because I've spent quite a bit of time with AOC's policy team, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez's policy team recently, the ones that came up with the controversial Green New Deal tag. And one of many bitter ironies is that when they talk about this vision, they are very explicitly driven by a sense of World War II mobilization, which is kind of odd because you don't normally think that left-wing socialists like to talk about, military organization, but, it's something which is, certainly driving the way they see the seriousness of the situation.
But it wasn't, my point is, it was not a military mobilization. It was an industrial mobilization.
Right, well that's...
And that's exactly what I'm talking about here. What won the war, frankly, was the machinery of the United States. I mean, obviously the brave men and women who sacrificed, obviously were on the front lines and deserve to always be heroes. But their ability to prevail was the result of an industrial revolution in this country that gave them the means to prevail. And that's what I'm talking about, is an industrial revolution.
I mean, the question I really want to ask is, do you think there's any likelihood or possibility of actually trying to forge an alliance with somebody like AOC group these days? Because I know that probably most people in the room are not naturally, instinctively drawn to all that side of politics, but if you look at what her policy team is talking about in relation to Green New Deal, and if you listen to what people on Wall Street who are embracing ESG and things like that are talking about, they're not always that different.
So
do you work with AOC?
Frankly, I work with anyone who wants to help, okay? But I think you need to go where the money is, and the money is in the government, and it's frankly in the infrastructure area. And I agree, I do think we can make a lot of progress without a price on carbon, but only the U.S. can if the U.S. doesn't participate, there will never be a price on carbon. The U.S. has to lead it. And I guess the last thing I'd say is, if we are the last best hope as a country, if we are the indispensable nation, we actually have to do something indispensable. And the only country that has the innovation, the economic might, and the economic influence to lead this fight is the United States. There is no other country that can do it. We have the technology, we have the innovation, we have the capital, we have the resources. We need to mobilize them.
Well, that's one hell of a call to arms. Matt, would McKinsey work with AOC?
We tend not to participate in political activities just because I think one of the challenges that you face is how do you make sure that the structure of the incentive system doesn't end up slowing down the rate of innovation. Because the innovation is going to come from a capital mobilization that's bigger than government. That's quite clearly the case. And if you just wait and rely on the government to fund that next piece, it's not going to solve the challenge. What I get excited about is, since 2009, the cost of solar has come down 90%. The cost of storage, which people said was a crazy thing to fund, has come down more than 90%. And you look at each of these different pieces, the kind of small modular carbon capture and sequestration that Edgar's driving, those kinds of technologies, small modular digitally enabled technologies are taking share in the energy system across the energy system. And I think that's the kind of thing that you can begin to scale at the kind of levels that we're talking about. And I think that's where we have to we really have to look at how do we drive that rate of innovation? How do we drive the capital deployment side? Because otherwise, we end up, in fact, in a political debate that narrows rather than broadens, that blocks rather than delivers.
Right. I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in just a few minutes, because I'm very conscious there are a lot of people in the room who are probably either invested in this area or looking at this area and have got very thoughtful points to make. So I'll turn to questions just a minute. Before I do, though, I'd like to ask you, Robert, do you think that the regulators have got it yet in terms of the scale of the risk? Because if you are correct that there is a big asset mispricing going on right now, it's got parallels with earlier episodes of asset mispricing. I mean, even the 2008 crisis, where the regulators were asleep at the wheel. I mean, are you predicting that in coming years, not only will we see investors waking up to this mispricing, but regulators needing to clamp down as well in terms of financial regulators?
I think that there's no question that regulators are starting to explore this issue, but because of the extraordinary systemic nature of this, it's very hard to get in front of it. I think that I would say a few things. Look, in order to incentivize this sort of technological fixes that we're going to need, governments are going to have to get involved to set the guardrails. The market is not just going to come up with a price of carbon by itself. I mean, it's ultimately an issue of waste disposal. I mean, there's a price for your sewage. There's a price for your trash collection. And there needs to be a price for this. As long as it's free to pollute, people will talk but do nothing. Regarding the progress, I mean, Paris was very optimistic, but I think chart 3 there shows just what's happened subsequent to Paris. Not only did emissions not level off, not only did they not go down like we need them, they actually made new highs in acceleration. So at some point, if you're on a diet but you keep gaining weight, there's obviously an issue, and this is the government and the regulators have to get really, really serious about this. I'd point out a few other things. It's very hard to deal with the nonlinearity of this issue, and so when we look at areas of weakness in the government, like let's take, for example, the real estate market, insurance. This is a crisis that ultimately will be a crisis of collateral values. And where we see it is that, the pain isn't particularly going to be the insurance companies in aggregate. These guys, when they're writing insurance on property, for example, they're writing one-year policies. So they understand climate change. They understand it's coming. They are very checked in, but they're also understanding that their policies are subject to change without notice, and if the policy prices go up too high, they will simply withdraw from the market. So places like California for fire insurance, I think in the next 10 years, flood insurance on the East Coast property market is going to be very, very tricky. We make assumptions when we buy assets that, what we've seen in the past will continue. But guys, the weather from our childhood is gone. And where we're going, we don't know. And it will really depend on coordinated guardrails put in by regulators and also by governments in terms of what they're prepared to accept. An example of some of the inefficiencies is this. One of my partners was talking to the insurance companies, saying, we've got there's a REIT here that's got very, very risky property. Why are you insuring it? And they say, well, look, we're only insuring it for a year. Each year we reset the premium. We go and talk to the REIT and say, why is it that you own all these risky properties? They say, don't worry, it's insured. And so these are very, 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 both statements are true, but, as investors, we hold the bag.
It's got shades of pre-2008 to that.
No doubt. I think that the two comments I've heard on the panel here is we have been framed on this issue, and we've been framed in a very specific way, and we need to liberate our frame. I think the comment from the two gentlemen regarding capitalism and what does it fit for purpose for? I mean, it ultimately has to support our values. And I think here, we're never at more risk than when the values of society are shifting, but as investors or as business people, as participants in the market, we are carrying on as though it's business as usual. I think that's a very, very tricky issue. It gets into, as those societal values shift, regulation will shift, market prices will shift, litigation risks will shift. What is currently not a big risk will become bankruptcy issues. I think all of these things are very tough for the regulators to get a handle on.
Well, of course, California has just seen a very real example of that in the utility sector. Any questions? Okay, yep, many questions. Okay, in light of many questions, can we keep them short, please? It would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself, and if you speak too long, I will cut you off.
Thank you. Hi, I'm David Alanowitz, Zero Carbon Partners. There's been a lot of talk about carbon pricing. Over the last 12 months, there have been two important pieces of legislation that have been passed. US 45Q offers up to $50 a ton for point source capture, direct air capture of CO2. The California Low Carbon Fuel Standard is a traded credit. It's traded today at $180 to $190 a ton. If you stack those two, it's over $200 a ton for point source or direct air capture of CO2. So my question to the panel is, with credits of $200 or more a ton, what's your view of the future of that and its potential of an impact on climate change?
Edgar, I think that's one for you. And then if anyone's dying to jump in, let me know, but if not.
Look, we created our direct air capture technology to be so low cost that it would be a profitable company without government subsidies, because you can't raise capital if you can't be profitable. And huge amounts of capital need to flood in here to help solve the problem. However, government subsidies help tremendously. And today, I mean literally today, we could build units that would be profitable if there were $220 or $230, even less than that, of subsidies available. We would be taking it out of the atmosphere and sequestering it in the ground and making money doing that at those prices.
I think we have a question over there, unless any of you. And then...
Thank you all. Really appreciate it. I'd love to hear each person's view on nuclear power and what role, if any, it plays and how you think about it. Thank you.
Anyone want to grapple with the thorny question of nuclear?
Looking
at Matt.
I'll take it.
McKinsey's paid to sound soothing.
Look, anyone who cares about climate change should be in support of nuclear. Nuclear is a very powerful approach. One of the challenges the U.S. has in meeting the Paris climate goals is we're closing down our nuclear units at too fast a rate. The challenge that nuclear faces is that it is not small, modular, nor digitally enabled. We are using end of World War II era technology, and we've advanced it a little bit, but we have to find a different model for nuclear in order to make it work. There's some terrific innovators in the small modular nuclear arena that could, in fact, begin to come into the market in the, let's call it the mid-2020s, but that actually requires a good bit of thinking about how we do things like regulation, and non-proliferation comes in, and a whole set of other topics become quite important there. But nuclear's got to be an important part of the conversation. Back to the, all people on deck. We need carbon capture and sequestration. We need nuclear. We need solar. We need natural gas. We need a broad range of solutions that sometimes I think, again, the conversation narrows when in fact we need each of them to be successful.
Paul, I'd like to quickly ask you, and then Roland.
Yeah, well,
as someone who's been, can the die-hard environmental movement ever embrace nuclear?
I don't think it's good to generalize and stereotype anything, including the environmental movement, because I think it's 70-80% of Americans care about the environment, their children, and the future, and their communities, and their rivers, and their water. So there's no such thing as a diehard. It's true that it often, as we said, circles the wagons and shoots at itself. But nevertheless, putting that aside, I think the nuclear issue has to be looked at exactly how Matt framed it, but further than that, it's really, when you think about it, kind of a pretty crazy way to boil water. Because that's all a nuclear power plant does, basically, with radioactive waste that lasts for 250,000 years. And we really do have to make breakthroughs there. And breakthroughs are being made. And there's a company down, Trial for Technologies, down in Rancho Margarita, that has a neutron beam accelerator used for actually their fusion reactor that actually can reduce nuclear waste dwell time from 250,000 years to 50 years. And they're talking to the EU and Paris and the Germans and the Chinese very soon about deploying that. Now again, talk about moral hazard. No, it's like do it. And if there's a way we can go to to the new class of nuclear reactors, fission and fusion, by the way, we need to do it. But I would say that at the same time, the nuclear power has suffered from the fact that the cheapest newly informed the cheapest form of electrical generation now in 83% of the world is wind. And it's cheaper than combined cycle gas and coal and nuclear by far, and you don't have a problem with insurance. And so we have to recognize that I think we've hit a crossover point when the cost of the solution has been always so more expensive than the cost of the problem. And so it was very hard for the market to equilibrate. But the fact is it's flipped. The cost of the solutions now are cheaper than the cost of the problem. And I don't think that's well understood and widely understood. And direct air capture is actually, and CCS is meeting that too, which at one time was like, yeah, $600 a ton, good luck. And the rate of innovation is extraordinary right now. Yeah.
You do make a good point, and I should say, for those of you who want to know more about the solutions that Paul's been promoting, you do have a sort of website and book, Project Drawdown, which tries to list some of these solutions.
We did, and I think it's because we came with a book, and I'll do it quickly, but Project Drawdown, and we enlisted scientists and researchers from all over the world, 26 countries, and every continent, to really map, measure, and model the 100 most substantive solutions to reversing global warming. And out of that research came the book. And what's emblematic about it, to me, it was the bestseller the first week out, even though my publisher didn't want to publish it because nobody reads books on climate. And but it's taught now from 4th grade to MIT graduate school. And the reason is because I think the world is so interested and compelled by, they want to do something. They want to know what's possibility. And as human beings, we don't move towards probability of doom. We don't move to fear. We don't move to threat. And we're tired of shaming and blaming and finger pointing. That's not going to get us anywhere. As people, we want to move to what is possible and what is extraordinary. And that's who we really are. And what Drawdown did is reflect back to the world, not what we know, but what the world is doing, what it knows, and how brilliant it is, and what's coming. And I think that's the message that's missing in this conversation.
Yeah, no, that's a very fair point. Roland and Robert, I know you both want to jump in on nuclear.
Yeah, just very quickly on nuclear power. And to Paul's point, the environmental community is not of one mind. There are groups that are more supportive. There are some groups that are very opposed. The Natural Resources Defense Council, we're somewhere in between. The 3 quick points to make about nuclear power. One, to Paul's point, where NRDC is at is that we want the most cost-effective, cheapest, most rapidly deployed clean energy technologies to get out there as fast as possible. Nuclear doesn't fit that bill right now. It's an expensive technology. Problem number 2 is that not all the externalities have been solved with nuclear power. And when you look at the United States regime on safety and waste and proliferation, and you broaden that out to other countries that are deploying nuclear reactors, and you should be seriously still very worried. Third point is that we've done an analysis regarding what is it going to take to decarbonize our economy by 2050 or so. And when you look at the deployment rates for even just replacing the existing fleet of reactors, which is about, there's 60-some plants and about 90-some reactors, and they're all scheduled to be retired sometime before 2050. If you look at that, the rate of replacement of nuclear power, just trying to replace it, it's it's much, much too high in terms of licensing these new power plants, siting them, and building them. So it's just not going to be a big part of the solution in 2050, in our opinion. There are better solutions out there. Will it be part of the solution? I think the answer is yes. But I think there are other technologies, namely wind and solar, which are simply going to outcompete it.
Right. Robert, do you invest in nuclear?
So we don't. Just to follow up on those points, you've heard about the cost curves, you've heard about the pricing. I think just to go take it back a little, bigger picture. How did we get into this mess? Like all market crises, we've had externalities that we didn't price, right? And we had misincentives where a few people profited from the production or consumption of carbon, and then the costs, those externalities were socialized. Here in nuclear, we go back to the same issue, which is that ultimately, we need to price the externalities. And so, if we have effective waste management and we can put a price on that, then great. But if not, we have to understand kind of the nature of the issue that we got ourselves into in the first place.
Fair point. We have a question over here at the front, and then I'm going to go on this side. So right at the back, there's a couple of questions over there.
Yeah, hi, David Elliott, run an Australian pension fund. Just a couple of comments. Firstly, the regulators are definitely cottoned on to the whole issue of climate change, and certainly in the Australian context, they're now asking all the pension funds to effectively talk and demonstrate what work they're doing with regard to climate change. So we're having to do that. The other point I just quickly want to make, there's some extraordinary work being done by Professor Bob Mumgard at MIT in the area of plasma fusion. It's about 14 years away. It's real. It's going to happen. We won't have to worry about nuclear. So just keep an eye on that. Just in the context of the whole debate around climate change, it's generally, as I understand it, and I think the political issue is that it's framed in the context of, are you prepared to save the planet in return for having reduced living standards? What are the views of the panel members in relation to that, and the broader issues? How do you bring India and China into this very, very important debate, given that Western countries have had a 200-year head start to effectively industrialise and feed their people and clothe their people and provide them with all the energy needs that they need?
Okay, well, I think that's quite a few questions there together, but they're all very important ones. Anyone want to touch on the India-China thing and/or the choice about living standards?
Well, I would say if we do this right, there's no reason why people's living standards have to change. I think that if you form enough capital and you go after enough solutions, there's no reason why people's living standards really need to change. And in fact, many people's living standards will be enhanced because in the environmental industrial complex, there'll be the creation of literally millions of jobs, number one. Number two, one misperception that people often have is that there's more pollution one place than another. It's just important to understand that CO2 is at the same level everywhere in the world. It's the same in Beijing as it is here, as it is in the middle of the Sahara Desert. So there are other particulates and other problems, but CO2 is the same everywhere. And India, well, China is moving much more quickly to try and reduce its dependence on coal. India, not so much. And this is why you cannot tell countries that they cannot develop for their citizens. You cannot tell them that they can't have refrigerated food systems. You cannot tell them that they can't build transportation infrastructure. We did it. We can't tell someone else that they can't do it. And that is why, among other things, we have to take CO2 out of the air, because even though there are 1,000 other things that we can and should be doing at the same time, we have to recognize that as the developing world develops, that there will be the increase that Robert noted after Paris, and that's likely to continue. So I think we can work with them to try and move, but we also have to be realistic. And I guess the last thing I would say is that I believe that as an asset class, one could create an asset class that was so-called climate solutions. Within 10 years, that will be the largest asset class in the world.
We are running slow on time, but yes.
Just one quickly on China. I think is an interesting case because China has made this a core part of industrial policy. They're the world's leader in solar. They intend to be, interestingly, the world's leader in electric vehicles by 2030. 30 million electric vehicles by 2030. The world only produces 105 plus or minus today. China wants a 30% market share by 2030 in electric vehicles. So clearly core part of their industrial policy. They put a price on carbon. They are clearly making a set of moves in the positive direction. I would say on the granularity of risk issue, so the broad theme says developing markets need substantially more energy services than they have today as part of their economic development. The challenge that we're going to face is that a set of those markets are also going to be hit hardest and earliest by climate change. If you take a look at the agricultural outputs, if you take a look at what happens to seafood activities, clearly getting hit in the tropics is much sharper. And unlike Miami, Bangladesh isn't going to have the money to be able to buy out with adaptation in the same way. And I think one of the real challenges from the global income inequality, I think China is trying to deal with it through industrial policy, but on a global basis, the costs and the benefits are not actually equally distributed. And that's going to be a challenge that we don't know how to solve right now.
I'd like to make one comment, though. I think we have to redefine what it means by standard of living, because this standard doesn't work at all. It's destroying the house. The house is on fire. But we're talking about standard. What do we mean? Do we mean safety? Yes. Do we mean education? Yes. Do we mean nourishing food? Yes. Do we mean, health care? Yes. But do we mean a system that actually stops creating unhealthy people? Yes, because that's the food system, which we talked about yesterday, which is basically creating obesity, type 2 diabetes, stroke, heart disease, etc. And so the standard of living I think we have been degenerating, frankly, on all levels, economically, socially, culturally, and so forth, and we've done extraordinary things as well. But the next book that comes out of our project is actually Regeneration, How to Create 1 Billion Jobs and Reverse Global Warming, because those are connected, because humans need a better home, a better place, a better city, a better community, better education, better health. And these things actually mesh perfectly with what we need to do to address global warming.
Roland.
The gentleman is absolutely correct to focus in on China and India, because the three largest carbon polluters in the world are now China, United States, and India. India is coming on very, very rapidly. Job number one to make sure China and India are doing their part is for the United States to do its part. President Trump has announced that he wants to pull out of the Paris Accord. Job number one is to prevent the United States from pulling out from the Paris Accord. And in fact, this week there will be an historic vote, the first climate vote in 10 years in Congress, where there will be a bill to prevent the U.S. from withdrawing from Paris. That's job number one. Second point, very quickly, I want to make is that when it comes to China and India, I was in India in February. I've been in China multiple times over the past 10 years. Air pollution in Delhi is horrendous. It's Blade Runner apocalyptic-like. If anybody's been to India, it's worse than you can imagine. It's worse than any experience I've had in China. The issue in China, there has been work in China to train attorneys in China, public interest attorneys, to enforce the rule of law when it comes to air pollution. Why? It's a political threat to the mandate, to the stability of the government to have pollution go unabated. If they can't provide jobs, they can't provide clean air and clean water, that's an existential threat to those governments. And that's why, besides the industrial component, that's why they care.
Well, thank you, Roland, because I think you've actually summed up in many ways the message from this overall panel, which is that if you look at what's happening today, there is a lot of reason to feel incredibly pessimistic and very alarmed about the seriousness of the situation. And yet, even amid that very pessimistic picture, there are glimmers of hope, glimmers of change of thinking, glimmers of new galvanization, not just amongst the groups that have been talking about this for a long time, but amongst a wider range of stakeholders in every sense, including people on this platform. And as I said at the beginning, I could not imagine this kind of panel happening 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, perhaps even 2 years ago. And if there's one thing we've learned from the last 10 years with the financial crisis, shocks do happen when risks are completely mispriced and misunderstood. But when they start to happen, the public perception, what people call the cognitive map, if you work in social science, can indeed change. And I suspect we're at one of those change moments now. Whether it goes far enough, not clear. But certainly there's a lot of very interesting things happening which affect almost all of you. So thank you for a very interesting, very bracing panel. Good luck figuring it out.